And Brendan, if you don't mind putting the link to the presentation in the chat, that would be great. I'm just going to briefly introduce Necessary Trouble Collective. This was started by Leonie and I about 3 years ago. And our mission is really to support people who work in particularly movement spaces, justice spaces, to have the access to the kind of skills and practices that support them to show up, to both care for themselves in those spaces, care for others in those spaces, show up fully in those spaces, and allow for others to do the same. And we're really interested in disrupting, the habits of dominance, right, wrong thinking, and the patterns we have of shaming and blaming folks, and reward and punishment, really trying to unlearn those practices. Okay, so I'm going to launch into our session, our presentation. I'm going to share my screen. If I can find, there we go. So can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Great. So, and sorry, Brendan, just remind me whether the recording has started. Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so today's session is managing when conflict leads to disconnection. So in our last two sessions, we went over conflict, kind of some of the elements that go into conflict and places along that process where we can disrupt or intervene in the conflict that can help us to sort of either disrupt it, bypass it, or sort of attend to it in the moment. And sometimes these strategies don't work. If you weren't with us in those first two sessions, I really encourage you to go back and watch the recordings. Again, if you need access to those recordings, you can't find them, please reach out. We'd be happy to share the links. So when we're not able to resolve conflict on our own with whoever it is that we're in conflict with, what are our options? And we're gonna look briefly at a number of these today, and then we're going to talk about some practices and some kind of foundational piece that can really help with all of this. So options when we can't resolve conflict amongst ourselves. Obviously, one is to reach out and get mediation support from a third party, or engage in restorative process. One of the important practices I know that I don't practice often enough, and I know how central it is to really embodying the kind of presence and supporting me to show up in the way that I want to, is about mourning the gap between the world that we are trying to create and the world that we live in, mourning our capacity and the gap between what we want to do and how we want to show up and how we can. Another option is to focus on shared purpose, lean into our community. And it can be really helpful in these situations to name the systemic factors that can be really underneath or foundational to the conflict that we're experiencing. So before I go any further, I'm going to just pause the sharing and check and see if there's any questions that come up for anybody before we move on.
I got one.
Yeah,
I have heard that phrase, mourning the gap, and I'm wondering if you like just know more or can say more about like where that comes from and yeah, your thoughts on it.
where the saying comes from, or what we mean when we talk about it.
I want to know where the saying comes from if you know it, but like I want to read like the source text on that one. But if you want to say more about what you like how you understand it, I'm also interested in knowing that too.
Yeah, I have not investigated the absolute source, but where it comes from for me is I have a nonviolent communication trainer named Mickey Cashton, and she often speaks of mourning the gap as being kind of a core practice that she uses in her work and her attempts to embody nonviolence and nonviolent communication. So I'm sorry I can't be any more help than that.
It's okay. I found her website.
Oh, good, great. I highly recommend her as a source of inspiration and thought. She's done incredible work in advancing, you know, both the kind of systems practical skills that we need, as well as the high level kind of thinking around the world that we're trying to create. So, highly recommend her work. Any other questions before we go back to looking at each one of those in a bit more depth? Yeah, I'd be happy to put her name in the chat for you.
I do. I'm following up on what Henry asked. I'm curious, is it possible to get a very like a brief example of maybe how that when you did that in practice? Because I'm having a hard time imagining it too.
Yeah. So, one of the ways it showed up in my life is in my family when I'm, struggling with a conflict, maybe with one of my children, and recognizing, particularly in the moment, not necessarily always, but recognizing in the moment that I don't have the resources, the grounding, the self connection to be coming from the place that I really want to come from, to be able to really embody the values that I'm trying to embody. And so naming it and taking time to grieve, not it's not a big thing, but just taking time to really let in how the systems we live in, the ways we're raised, the ways we're isolated and cut off from each other, the systemic stories of separation and scarcity, all feed into us not necessarily having access to our skills, our capacity, our energy, our in moments or even sometimes ever to be able to bridge the gap between how I want to be showing up in a relationship and how I am actually showing up in that relationship in this moment. Does that help? Does that answer? Great. And I
Yeah.
also want to credit Mickey Cashton again. One of her phrases I love is this situation is beyond my skill level. It's an acknowledgement that I haven't gotten to the level of skill that I want to have, and and I there's still a gap between the skill I have and how I want to meet this moment. Yeah,
Thank you.
great. Any other questions?
That's a tough one. I think that one of the things we experience when we see that disconnect, myself anyway, is just finding a space where I can let go of judgment of myself, how I failed, I didn't measure up to my aspirations for how I would show up. Could I have done something different? A lot that questioning and letting go, finding a way to let go of that negative kind of self-harm we can do when we see that disconnect between who we want to be and who we might be seen as by somebody else. That kind of, yeah, it's part of the work
Right,
for me
exactly.
anyway. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Thanks for contributing that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing. So we're going to look at each of these different options. This is just a high level overview. So mediation and restorative processes. So one thing to be really mindful of is that these processes are really only an option if both parties or everybody involved is willing to engage in it. And it isn't something you can force on somebody. So that's kind of a key foundational piece that we need to, and we can work with people to try to get them to that place, but some people may never get to that place. It's important when engaging in this to ensure that the practitioner that is supporting the process is someone who can engender the trust of everybody involved. That's also key. And it becomes, it requires more skill of the practitioner, the mediation or restorative process practitioner, when we are navigating significant differences in access to power and privilege. And that's because you really want somebody that has that systemic lens, that understands how that shows up and is able to name it and able to support people to recognize how that might be showing up in what's happening. And these processes can break down if one or both people just are not able to get past the hurt, the impact, or let go of a particular outcome that they're looking for. Any questions about that? And again, this is just a super high level. These are some options. We're not going to go into detail on them, but we are going to look at a practice that supports these. Yeah, so again, mourning the gap, going back to that conversation that we had. And, you know, some of the things that it's important to recognize what creates the gap. And I named some of them, but we need, you know, recognizing that trauma can have a really big impact on creating a gap between how we want to be in the world, how we want to show up, how we're able to both attend to impact and attend to repair or receive attempts at repair. Again, that another piece is this relative privilege, and recognizing that privilege, one of the challenges with having privilege is that part of how it functions is it keeps us unaware of or it can keep us unaware of the lived realities of people who do not share our privilege. And we struggle to even recognize that those realities can be true. It can be very hard for folks. Also recognizing how structural power, you know, if you're in an organization and somebody has structural power over another person, that's another place where a gap can be created. And it's, you know, it's not because of the individuals and their desire to try to come together or try to show up well. It's built in, baked into these systems that we've learned, and that kind of often get imposed on us. Then there's our individual capacity, which fluctuates hour to hour, day to day, you know, depending on what's going on in our lives. And as David pointed out, it's super important to be compassionate with ourselves and recognize that we don't always have the capacity, and be willing to acknowledge that and be willing to hold that with care. Our own judgments, self-judgments, and judgments of others get in the way and can create a gap. And then, you know, hypervigilance, which is often something that comes out of trauma, is another kind of mechanism that can get in our way in terms of creating a gap between, you know, what happened and our experience of what happened, and our capacity to be able to step into the reality of what happened versus what we think or what we're telling ourselves actually happened. I'm going to pause there again and just check in with folks and see if there's any questions or clarity needed, anything coming up in those two pieces.
Well, I do have a reflection. Sorry, I couldn't find the hand raise feature.
Oh yeah, no problem. Hi, Maggie.
Um, and I don't know exactly how to phrase my question, but it's in regards to a comment that you made about privilege, and
Mhm.
sometimes we don't recognize the privilege or the unintended ways that that's creating a power dynamic, and our mindfulness around it. I think for me, based on where I'm at and my lived experience, while I am privileged in many ways, I also lack a great deal of privilege and or experience a lot of barriers. And while I advocate for the removal of those barriers for others, and sometimes for myself, being aware of it isn't enough, right? Because I don't have the maybe resources to address, or to better support, because of my lack of privilege, right? So I think just to add that the two can coexist, right? Even when you are aware, and are actively working to address those gaps and barriers. And maybe that's part of the added mourning that you go through, is that you see the problem, it's very evident, and you're working from within the system to change it, but then you have very limited power or resources to change the status quo, and then you end up absorbing some of the harm or oppressive ways that the systems work. So yeah, maybe it wasn't a question, but just a contribution.
Yeah, I really appreciate that contribution. It is another place where, so the gap that I was talking about specifically on that point was just the barrier to being able to see and understand somebody else's lived experience. But I really appreciate this piece that you're bringing in, which is also, even when I can, again, we can never really understand somebody else's experience, but at least even when I am aware and I do have that understanding, and I don't necessarily, I may not necessarily have the resources or the capacity to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm so grateful for you bringing that in. Thank you. Yeah. Anything else before we continue? Okay, well, I'll go back to sharing. Okay. So just some notes on this. Part of the process of mourning the gap, this can be done as an individual, but it can also be done together with the other person who you are in conflict with, or people. And it can be a way that can kind of help bring back some sense of connection, or at least some softening towards each other, and can help us to release blame and judgments, again, self-judgments, or of our self-judgments or judgments of the other. And we can, name these things that are getting in the way, whether it's unprocessed trauma, which can lead to low trust, and as we mentioned, hypervigilance, whether it's, struggling to take accountability for our actions, because that can feel incredibly risky, again, depending on whether somebody has structural power over you or other reasons. Our lack of capacity and creativity, and this lack of understanding across difference. And as Marangis, is that who I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name?
Yeah, you got it right. Thank you.
Marangis mentioned, that other piece about, and then there's the access to resources gap of being able to actually attend to what's happening. So another way that we can kind of continue to work despite not being able to resolve conflict is to focus on our shared purpose. And I think, in my experience, this is one of the things that we don't necessarily do well, particularly in spaces that are working for just social justice, working for equity, working for a world that works for everyone. We sometimes believe that we cannot collaborate with somebody unless we completely align in our beliefs on everything, or there's no issues between us. There's just harmony and easy relationships. And this can be a really big problem for organizations. It can cause organizations to fall apart. It can cause people to leave, and it ultimately leads us to having less collective power than we could have, because there is always, or almost always, common ground somewhere. There's always a shared purpose that you're both working towards. You may have different strategies about how to get there, but ultimately there's focusing on trying to attend to that shared purpose, trying to find that common ground, that shared ground, is what really helps us to build our broader coalitions, and that is what makes us more effective in our work. Another option is leaning into community, and one of my beloved mentors, Kazu Haga, wrote a book called what was his first book? Shoot, I'm not remembering the name of it now. I can only think of the second book. I'll remember it at some point. It's on nonviolence, and one of the quotes from that book that I love is, I want everybody to be part of my beloved community. Some folks, maybe they just need to be over there, a little bit removed from me. And so, recognizing that I don't necessarily need to be in a good, solid relationship with everybody that I'm in community with. But I want everyone in my community to have solid, connected relationships. And that can come from other folks. That's how we work collectively and we support each other. And again, that's where the power comes from. So communities and our organizations and even broader coalitions, they're all a web of connections. And, we sometimes buy into this very individualistic perspective on the world, on our place in the world, our role in the world. And we need to really lean into that sense of interdependence. And, building these kinds of broad coalitions, building beloved community, requires that, we really want everyone to be part of the community, but it also requires and feel welcomed in that community. And it also requires boundaries and clarity, and boundaries done with love and care, both at the individual level and at the collective level. So I'm going to pause again, check in, see where folks are at, see if there's any questions coming up or any comments or what people want to. Yeah, Hannah, welcoming your voice.
Hi, yeah, I like this description of community a lot, and it just recalled for me something I heard at a potluck recently. And I wish I knew the organizer. I know it was an organizer from Philadelphia who says all the time, if you look around the room and you notice that you like everybody who's there, that's not community. Those are your friends. And that was so helpful for me in thinking about what does community really mean and this context of organizing and what we're trying to do. You don't have to like everybody, and it's probably not the best if you do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think what that brings to mind for me is, where we learn and grow and stretch is in the friction. It is in that place where we don't necessarily agree, or we struggle with somebody and how they show up, or we, don't know how to navigate something. And that's where the opportunity is. And if we can remember that when we're feeling frustrated with somebody or, you know, some folks, and try to really embrace that opportunity, that can be super helpful. Yeah, Shri, go ahead.
I really appreciate what you shared, Hannah, and I think I agree. I think, you know, but it's what you said after Catherine around boundaries and clarity and you know, just sort of thinking about how boundaries are a practice of love. But I think it's so hard because I feel like that's sort of one of those gaps. I mourn because I don't know that that's something that we are taught. Like you know, at least I don't see it in practice at all. It's like used, it's weaponized. I've seen that happen, but there's nothing around like boundaries with love and clarity. Um, and it just makes me think about another thing Hannah, you know, just introduced me to. This was a couple years ago. One of her mentors, Akaya Winwood, who said, talked about the difference between kindness and niceness, and how kindness, it's like you're stepping into the discomfort, right? Niceness is just staying in your lane, whatever is like going to keep you comfortable. It's not about the community or the other. And that's how I've been thinking about boundaries too. So yeah, I love beloved community, and I feel like family is a good example of how we're already part of that. Because a lot of times you're sitting at that table and you're like, want to sit at, you know, there's some that you prefer on the other side of the table, but it's the boundaries thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for lifting that piece up. Yeah, Heather. And David, did you want to speak? I saw you unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to Heather first. Is that okay? And then,
Sure.
terrific.
Yep.
Heather, go ahead.
I was just thinking about, I'm appreciating all of these different perspectives and thinking about how sometimes it feels easier to deal with friction with someone who's not as close. And the closer the person is within community, sometimes it can be harder to actually address it. So it's because as sort of in principle, as things were being shared, I was thinking, well, in our communities where we can practice these things so that then we can address them on a larger scale. But I realized that actually, in terms of practice, sometimes for me, it feels easier on with people who have where there is that space is already there. And so it's just making me realize, okay, where are the places to practice? And that maybe it's different at different times or different in different situations, but just being aware of those differences. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. And, you know, practice, there's a couple of things that come to my mind. One is, you know, in a community, having agreements around how you will attend to things is, and making it really explicit can be helpful in kind of creating the container that then makes it easier to step into these things and either assert a boundary or, you know, have a more challenging conversation. And then the other piece is recognizing as we're learning these skills, practicing with things that aren't so big, you know, like taking opportunities where there's something small or something that doesn't feel so so huge to practice with is a really great way to kind of like start to build up the skill and the capacity to attend to the bigger things. David.
Yeah, this is really a really very interesting conversation. You know, Sri Kim and I are part of a coalition group, and it's been around for about 5 years. And without getting into any nitty gritty, you know, over time, you can build a culture of this is how we navigate differences as a coalition. This is a way we provide a brave space for people to share difficult things. And then you celebrate how wonderful people are doing building this kind of culture, and people feel a sense of safety and comfort that we can handle some of these tough things because we have these core priorities that we reinforce from time to time and say, this is why we're here. This is what we're doing. And then a grenade can be thrown into that by just a very polarizing issue that we haven't seen before. And it just hits, it just blows up in people's faces. And it's like, well, what was that? And where did that come from? And how do we actually now do the hard work of trying to, what we're talking about right now is that restorative process of coming together and naming things and making space for discomfort and sharing without judgment. It sounds really good in principle, but we're trying to do that now. It's, you can become pretty complacent and think, yeah, this is a wonderful group and we're doing so well. And then, well, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to grow from this. It doesn't feel like we want to actually take this on. It's hard work, right? To do this work, it's going to be hard work for a while. And so now we have to do that hard work. And to your point, do we have the skill sets in our toolbox to help us? Do we have a framework to work with, a container with things we can use? So we're trying to do that now. And so this is a very timely session we're having right now. So I thank you for us being here tonight.
Oh, great. And I do want to mention, you know, these things can come as such a shock.
Man.
You know, these divisive issues can, like, and you both, you know, sides, everybody involved is just like, what just happened? You know, I had this very similar experience in my faith community, and I was like, I was confident that we were all on the same page on this, and we weren't. And the shock of that can be part of the challenge we have to overcome, is that piece, as well as doing the hard work of attending to it. But acknowledging, whoa, like what just happened and how that impacts everybody, is, I think, an important step or a piece of the repair work. Yeah. Thanks for that. Kim.
I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I'm just kind of picking up on what David has shared. And, you know, so I'm just really thinking deeply about collective boundaries, right? So it took me a really long time to figure out personal boundaries. And so still doing that work there. That's like lifelong, I think, but it's that those collective boundaries. And I know, you know, we can do work around community guidelines and those kinds of things that we co-create together and kind of sign off together, and you know that it's you know horizontal, you know, process, and not hierarchical, you know, but it's those collective boundaries, and when basically shit hits the fan, you know, is accessing those to help guide us, right? So, and that's when it's the gap. And I'm thinking also a lot about the mourning the gaps, and you know how transparently I can feel very out of my depth. So theoretically different thing, but just when it comes to the practical and the emotional, it's challenging.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's something that came to mind in what you were sharing. One of the things that we sometimes don't do enough of in community is recognizing, like, drawing on folks who have are resourced in moments and others who aren't, and being really gentle with each other, you know, with care, calling people back into, or pointing out those boundaries, or pointing out those agreements, and you know, and checking in with everybody involved, finding out where folks are at from a resource perspective. Do you feel resourced to step in this moment? Like really distributing the leadership and the willingness to step into things when stuff gets hard, and inviting that, and trying to draw on the collective resources, not just the individual. Brendan.
An example of that might be that we had a 5:36 possible first breakout room on our agenda, but now we're at 5:46. Maybe we're just pointing out the time. What do you want to do, Catherine?
Thank you, Brendan. I appreciate that. Yeah. So I do really want us to be able to get to our practical stuff. So I'm going to go to our last piece of just kind of like the overview that I've been doing, and then look at this practice that I wanted to share. So the last piece that I wanted to spend some time on was naming the systemic. And, you know, it can be really helpful to recognize that almost all conflicts have some element of the systemic as part of them. And sometimes it's the main cause. And this can be things like the organizational structures that we've inherited or that we adopted because we couldn't think of anything better, and how that allows for power to be used outside of process. The power and privilege differences that we talked about, that can lead to misunderstandings or a minimization of concerns or harm. The decision-making processes that we have in place and how that can leave out key voices and perspectives. The scarcity and separation mindset narratives that introduce fear and mistrust. And then, of course, trauma that can often comes from systemic oppression and can really limit our capacity for both limit our capacity and our ability to trust in processes and community and others, and even ourselves. So getting to some practices that help. So we're going to spend a chunk of time today on this process that is called dissolving enemy images. This is a process I was introduced to about 16 years ago when I was intensively studying nonviolent communication. And it's one of my favorite processes. Every time I do it, I'm shocked. The first couple of times I did it in relationship to my children, I was shocked to realize that I was holding what is labeled an enemy image of my children, my very young children. So what do we mean by enemy image? Essentially, it's just a judgment or a diagnosis or a story that we hold about somebody else that impairs our ability to really empathize with that person and to see them as a whole human being. And so the process that we're going to practice this process in breakouts, is to identify and list the judgments or the diagnosis or the story that we have, identify our feelings and needs. So Brendan, actually, if you could throw the feelings and needs list into the chat, the links to those right now, that would be amazing. Associated with these judgments or diagnoses, one of the liberating pieces that I learned in nonviolent communication is, at least from that paradigm, everything we do, and this is like goes to every thought we have, everything we do is motivated by a core shared human need, something that's beautiful, something that's life-serving. We don't always enact strategies to try to meet those needs that are life-serving, but the needs themselves are. Then we want to get clear on what matters most to us, just to really settle and be clear. And then we shift our focus to the other person, and we recognize that their behavior, irregardless of how we feel about it, is motivated by needs that we share that matter to us as well. And we can identify those and guess at those. We may not get them right, and that's not really that important. But that just helps us to create a narrative about what's motivating the behavior of the other person that can really soften us towards them, loosen our judgments about them, and open up some compassion. And that practice has been instrumental in me repairing relationships with people in my community, in my family, in my life. So we're going to get a chance to practice this. So we're going to take 2 or 3 minutes right now to just journal on your own, write down a description of a conflict or something that you're in the middle of. and try to list your judgments or your story, whatever it is that you're holding about the other person. We'll take a few minutes to do that, and then we're going to go into breakout pairs and work with each other to identify the feelings and needs that we have underneath those judgments.
I think I'll pause that recording now, maybe. And
Sure.
yeah.
Space being may not be important to them, but I just want you to
Thanks.
know that
Thanks,
that is part of it.
Welcome back. Hopefully
Welcome
that
back.
was meaningful for everyone.
Mm.
So in the interest of time, because I really do want you to get the second half of this, because that's kind of the key piece for me, the turnaround, is was there anyone who struggled with kind of guessing some needs behind a particular judgment that they want to, you know, offer, and we can see if we can come up with something, or anything, you know, particularly meaningful that you want to share, a question you want to ask before we go on to our second half of this.
I'll just share that with our group, we didn't do the guessing. I think because we're still getting to know each other in our situation. We just said, well, how do you feel about it? Instead of me kind of applying my label to it. So I don't know. That was just one piece for us, but I can see the value of having an external person kind of hear and reflect back what you share.
Yeah,
That
thanks
was
for
my
that. And
partner speaking, so thank you for sharing. But I feel like we kind of worked together on it too, so that was nice and not bad for only just meeting for the first time ever. So we collaborated in our true collaborative styles.
excellent.
We worked on it.
Yeah, and it's, you know, these are always invitations. You can work with them in the way that feels the most helpful. And yeah, really want to recognize and acknowledge. Yeah, it can be hard to guess when you've just met somebody. So excited that you figured out a workaround that worked for you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so our second breakout is now we kind of flip it, and this might be where you could use some support from your other person. Trying to guess the feelings and needs of the other person involved. And, you know, I would encourage you to focus on the needs. The feelings are indicators of needs, but really it's when we get to really tapping into needs and feeling is where we start to build that kind of compassion and empathy for the other person. So any questions or clarity needed before we go into our second breakout? Yes, Brendan.
Catherine, so right now the rooms are set up so it would be the same rooms if I just open them up right now. Is
Yes,
that the intention? Cool.
That is the intention. Yeah, we'll put you back in the same pairs.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we'll do 8 minutes this time. I'm sorry to cut you a little short, but that'll give us a bit of time to kind of debrief at the end before we go into our closing. So we start the recording just awesome. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Oh, so I'd love to hear from a couple of folks, either a question or what that was like, any ahas, anything that shifted and working in that way. Anyone feel moved to share? Yeah, David.
Well, I think that the experience made me help me to open up some more space to see the other person's experience and what are some of the needs underlying their choices, some of the how difficult it is for them to take some ownership because there's a lot at stake for them. And so I think as we went back and forth, Henry and myself, you know, his was a very personal kind of story. Mine was more kind of with a group, but it was good to step outside of my own lens, my own frame of reference, and kind of park that on look at the other person's. So it's a helpful exercise. It was pretty good.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And hopefully you all got a worksheet that I sent the link to that you can use when you're, I highly encourage anytime there's something where you're like, I'm relating to this person, or I'm showing up in a way that I'm not happy about, or whatever, just pull it out and have a look. And I've found it to be an incredibly beneficial practice. Thanks. Anyone else have anything they want to share? Or what that was
I
like?
agree with David. I agree with David. I was in his group, but I agree.
Great.
One thing
Heather.
that I realized was that there's a difference for me. There's another step between having a sense of the other person's experience in what my initial sense is of it as sort of a statement versus their needs. Like that's a deeper level or another layer, where what experience I've had before of where, okay, yep, the needs are quite similar, maybe. I don't know. I don't know exactly, but in what my initial intuition is, it seems like, oh, right. It's interesting that maybe we have these same needs and it feels like it's being expressed so differently, and that just seems so confusing, but that somehow that sharing of that may help in being able to speak to the person about it. Um, we'll see. I'll report back.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, it is surprising to me how frequently that's the thing, is that I'm in conflict with somebody and we're both going after the same need, and our strategies are just like button heads, but it's like we are both trying to get this need met. Yeah, Shri.
Yeah, this is really powerful exercise. So I want to say thank you. I have a
Okay.
feeling it's going to be some, it's feels like some painful processes in my way, but it's pretty incredible. And I think what I'm surprised by is realizing how much it also like gives you it sort of lets you trust yourself, right? Like I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about this, we mask or we're not as brutally honest with ourselves because we have to, perform a certain way or come off a certain way or, calling in versus calling out. Like, how do I present and what I love about this is like, wait a minute, I can trust who I am or my values or how I want to show up, even if I'm not showing up that way yet. Right. So that's sort of, yeah, that's something about it that I really appreciate.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Yeah, this practice has been humbling. It's definitely given me the opportunity to look at some hard truths about myself and how I navigate the world. But I want to see them. I want to see them because they're out of alignment with how I really want to be and my values. And so when I do actually get to see them, then I have agency. I have choice about what I do about that. And again, I can't always access that choice. I don't always have the capacity, but there's a much higher likelihood, and I've gotten better at, even in the moment, if I can't navigate it the way I want to, working with it and then coming back and doing the cleanup, the repair, the acknowledging and sharing what I discovered as I kind of worked through all the hard parts of it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something really about this framing that like the framing of our whole conversation beforehand, that was just has made this exercise like really stand out. I've done this a number of times in just like NVC spaces where it's like, oh wow, you guys really like we really do a great job in some NVC spaces of I had written the misunderstanding and minimalizing the concerns and harms of the less privileged, of the marginalized, and just like, yeah, just hearing the like my partner speak, it was like really felt that like that was being held, that there was no minimization, and like that like we don't have to do that in order to, you know, to navigate conflict.
Beautiful. Glad to hear that, Henry. I mean, that's certainly a critique of NVC, is when you kind of take it out of context and you don't provide all of the external factors and systemic pieces, it can lead to more disconnection, actually, and more harm. So
I feel like in so many spaces, like the mourn the gap is just like it's used as like spiritual bypassing. It's kind of like, well,
yeah,
nothing I can do.
yeah.
Instead of like a moment to like really, I think it's an invitation to look at where you want to go.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so it's 6:26 and I want to honor your time and wherever you need to go next. So we will close up, but this isn't the end of the conversation. As I said, we welcome you reaching out any time to ask questions or seek clarity, participate in any of our future offerings. So just a couple of things in closing, a couple of housekeeping things. Brendan, I'm wondering if you can put in the chat the info about making a contribution, the links to that. And yeah, this work, as we've said, is offered on the basis of the gift economy. So we want to make sure it's accessible to everyone who wants and needs it. And we also are
should
really...
I stop this recording now, or?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Will do here. Okay.
Thank you.